Yeah, I think the first thing, Luke, is to have some empathy with the guys in your program, right? They don't know who I am, and understand. Okay, if I was 18 or 22 year old, what would I be worried about? So making sure that our first team meeting, I really kept that in the back of my mind, and I wanted to make sure right away that they knew that I wanted everybody in our program to stay in our program, and I made them understand that they were all of a sudden they were our players as being our new staff. It wasn't going to be new recruits versus old recruits trying to run guys out. I also let them know that I thought there was a lot of talent in the locker room and that we could do something pretty special. I didn't know how quickly we'd turn some wins and losses, but I wanted to let them know I believed in them and I wanted them.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Coach Ben Wilkins back to the podcast. Coach Wilkins is the head men's basketball coach at Seton Hill University. He was formerly the associate head coach for Army men's basketball. In this two-part conversation, we dive into lessons Ben learned taking over a program, including how he left his previous job well, priorities when he took over a new program, establishing a culture in year one, evaluating your roster, working with your assistants, and more. As always, if you enjoy this episode and you want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. And coaches, I'm running the second Film for Coaches workshop with Doug Lamov on Wednesday, May 3rd at 12:05 p.m. Central Time. We're going to take a deep dive into how to use film effectively to improve the learning and performance of your team. The workshop is 90 minutes long and includes rules of thumb for using film effectively, examples of film sessions, a Q&A, and more. Spots are limited and it's already filling up. You can grab your spot at filmforcoaches.com and you can see what coaches from the previous workshop had to say about their experience. Now to my conversation with Ben Wilkins. Enjoy the show. Coach is really excited to have Coach Ben Wilkins back on the podcast for the second time. And before I turn it over to Ben, let me tell you why he's back on the podcast for a second time. First of all, I think the situation that he just went through in this last year is going to provide a lot of helpful insight for a lot of people. And then second of all, Coach Wilkins is, I admire him a lot because it's very clear and obvious that he is committed to coaching. He's committed to growing and learning. I'll give you a very practical example of this for the listener. After we recorded our first conversation together, probably a little bit over a year ago, Ben afterwards said, "Hey, could you give me some feedback on the conversation?" And that's not a super common thing for people to ask me after we record a podcast together. Oftentimes someone will say, "Hey, how'd I do?" And it's like, "Yeah, you did great." But Ben was very serious about, "Hey, could you give me some constructive feedback? I'm trying to get better as a communicator." And I did. I think I followed up on an email after I had a chance to think about it a little bit and just gave him a few thoughts that I had and feedback of where he could improve as a communicator. And he received that feedback with open arms. And so I think that speaks a lot to Ben and his commitment to growth. And just wanted to throw that out there for the listener as you're hearing this conversation. You are getting to learn from someone who I respect a ton and I think has a ton of valuable insight to share. So with that, Ben, I will toss it over to you, and I want you to tell the audience about the last year of your life. About a year ago, right now, you were still the associate head coach at Army, and then you took a new job over. Tell them about that new job and what that process was like of taking over a new program and becoming a first-time head coach.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Excited to be back on. And as you said, I made the move. I've always wanted to be head coach, and I got a unique opportunity to come to Seton Hill, which is a Division II school in the PSAC in Pennsylvania. We're around Pittsburgh. Great, great athletic league, terrific basketball. So it's been a whirlwind. I'm kind of looking forward to the summer to actually take a deep breath because I feel like I haven't since maybe the last time we were on the Zoom together, the Zoom podcast together. So the transition for me has been it's been an unbelievable opportunity to learn and grow, Luke. And I think the one thing as an assistant, you have all these ideas that you want to implement, but then when you're the head coach and you're the ultimate decision maker, now you get to implement some ideas, and then you find out what works and what doesn't work, and you're learning a lot. And I think I grew as much this year as I probably had the best 6 or 7 combined, just because of a different experience, a different perspective. So we took over a rebuild type program when it comes to wins and losses. The program had won 3 games the previous year, and we had done a good job this year, won 16. I know we're going to dive in a little bit how we did it. A lot was the young men in our program. I was very fortunate to inherit some unbelievable kids that worked really hard, really were bought into each other, bought into what we're trying to do. It's kind of where we are now. Year one's kind of past us, and now we're looking to the future. But it's going to be fun to reflect and talk about what we did well, and what happened in year one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start with actually, can we start with this? And this just came into my mind. You were the associate head coach at Army, and interviewing last spring. I'm assuming for this job, you interview, you get the job. Will you actually tell us how you closed out your time at Army? Like, what was that like when you left that program? You could talk about the conversations you had with your head coach, players. I just love to know how you handled leaving a job that you'd been at for a while.
It's a great question. It starts with Jimmy Allen. I worked for Jimmy for 6 years, and he's incredible for me to help me grow there. And we sat in his office, and he was supportive the whole way about me. And we shared some tears and talked through some memories. And it was really special because there was some closure there. We were proud of what we did as a program, and it was cool to do it together at such a special place. And then there's tears. When you leave and it matters, talking to the guys was really hard. It was hard for me to even get words out that I was leaving. And but they were so supportive and so excited because I'm pretty vulnerable with our guys. So they knew I wanted to be a head coach. They knew I was driven. So they were really excited for me to be able to do something I've always wanted to do. And one of the coolest things, David Belfield, is that now the head coach at Belmont Abbey Division II. He put together a scrapbook. And so, Luke, I have a scrapbook of letters from all of our players, pictures, and that's I have two. It's one of the two most prized possessions I have. And actually, that scrapbook, I read it before games at home because it helps remind me of why I do it. It's not wins and losses. It's things they've said in that letter about impacting people. So that was a very emotional send off, and having that reminder of why you do is pretty cool. And I give David Belfield a lot of credit for doing that for me.
Oh, that's awesome, man. That's such a good idea with the with the scrapbook. Well, I respect the way you handled that a lot. Yeah, I think that's a situation again that many coaches find themselves in. You're leaving a job to take another one, and I think it's important to handle it well. Talk to us about your priorities when you took over the Seton Hill job. So again, yeah, first time head coach. You're going in a program that is rebuild from a wins and loss perspective. They hadn't won a lot in the last year. I'm guessing maybe the last few years before that as
Correct.
well. And now you're taking it over. And what were your priorities?
Yeah, I think the first thing, Luke, is to have some empathy with the guys in your program, right? They don't know who I am, and understand. Okay, if I was 18 or 22 year old, what would I be worried about? So making sure that our first team meeting, I really kept that in the back of my mind, and I wanted to make sure right away that they knew that I wanted everybody in our program to stay in our program. And I made them understand that they were all of a sudden they were our players as being our new staff. It wasn't going to be new recruits versus old recruits trying to run guys out. I also let them know that I thought there was a lot of talent in the locker room and that we could do something pretty special. I didn't know how quickly we'd turn some wins and losses, but I wanted to let them know I believed in them and I wanted them. And then it went from there. Is the first 3 or 4 days, Luke, all I did was focus on our guys. I didn't worry about staff. I didn't worry about recruiting. And I set up a time to meet with each player from 30 minutes to an hour. And I'm a big walker. So there's a track around our gym or outside, and we would just walk and talk. And I asked a lot of open ended questions. And then I probed. And I just be, hey, Luke, tell me about yourself. And and guys would go. Some guys would go right basketball. Some guys would go life. And I'd dig into those questions. I wanted to get to know them, and then I'd ask a little bit about, hey, what went wrong? What do you think one thing we can do to do better? And I would just kind of got to know them. And I didn't do very much talking, Luke. I did a lot of listening. And then what I did with each player is I called a parent and a coach from each player, because I wanted to let them know, especially parents, we get their most prized possession. Me and you, before we got was talking about our kids. That's the most prized possession I have is my kids. So I want to make sure they know who I was, that I wanted their son, and I wanted to get to know who their son was through their eyes as a parent, and the coaches as well. So I wanted to make sure that our players knew right away, that I cared about them as people, and then they could ask any questions with me. They asked a lot of questions with me, and I really think that that first 3 or 4 days set the foundation to have a great year, because we built relationships right away. And before you battle, you got to bond. Before we go into games and wins and losses, we got to get to know each other. So I spent a lot of time just to get to know our guys, and that was all I cared about the first 3 or 4 days.
Coaches, if you're not taking notes, you should be. I am taking notes right now. You can get the notes from this conversation and see mine. I am impressed with how you handled that. That's fantastic. I think there's a few things that stood out. Number one, you said you wanted them to know that you believed in them and you wanted them there. I think especially right at the college level that you're at, but even more so, increasingly at the younger levels, high school, junior high, your kids need to know that you want them there, because obviously you guys have a transfer portal in college, but high school, junior high coaches know too that there's lots of transferring that happens, whether it's right or not, whatever. It happens a lot, right? And I've heard people talk about, like, you got to recruit your own kids first. And so I respect that you came in and that was priority. Hey, I want to make sure these kids know there are kids now. It's not we're bringing in kids versus the kids that were here. It's all of these kids are our kids now. Our staff's committed to the kids that are here. And then, yeah, just, I mean, huge respect for the way you handle those first few days, taking the time to meet with every player, getting to know them, asking questions, listening. I mean, what a huge, what so practical, and what a huge advantage that you said, like you said, you think that that gave you an advantage, how you uh, started about this journey from the very beginning. And then the thing that really separates what you did from, I think, what a lot of coaches would do, right? Because if I was in that situation, I didn't think I would do similar things, right? Maybe not exactly like you did it, but I recognize how important those things are. But the thing that was like, duh, when you said it, is that you called a parent and a coach from each player and you had a conversation with them. Again, especially at the college level where their parent and coach isn't probably local, right? If if the parents are local, your high school, junior high, you could even have a quick meeting with all of them. But I think that's so powerful too, because their parent, that former coach, it's probably an important voice in their life. And if you have a relationship with that person, really, if you gain their trust and they know that you're genuine, you care about their son, you care about their former player, you want good for them, and all of a sudden, Jimmy calls mom because he's frustrated about practice and playing time, and mom says, "Hey, Coach Wilkins cares about you. Go to him,
Mhm.
right? He's a good guy. He's there for you. He's not out to get you, right?" Because that parent trusts you now because you took the time to invest in that relationship too, because that's a key relationship between you and the parent. And it's actually funny. This thought was just jogged in my mind as I was talking about that example. I don't know if you've read the book or not, Ben, The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan
I
Heath.
have, yeah.
If Yeah, yeah, which again doesn't surprise me that you've read it based on how you handled it. But he shares this example of how this school did home visits in the summer, and this school that just had no parent engagement, school's a mess, behavior issues, and they just committed, hey, we're gonna go sit in the homes of the families in our school this summer and have 15-minute meetings, and it just caught fire. Like, parents were upset because they hadn't had their meeting yet, because they heard other parents were getting their meeting. And then when they come back to school, like their back to school assembly that they usually had 20 parents at, like, they had the gym packed, standing room only. There's like 300 parents there, right? Because now all of a sudden, this school had demonstrated we care, and we're willing to go out of our way to make the effort to show you that we care, to support your son or daughter, because like you said, that is literally a parent's most prized possession. We were talking about our kids before we started recording. Like, they're the most important things to it. And I care so much about the adults that are around my kids, that they care about my kids too, that I trust them with my kids. And so I just don't think we can understate the importance of that. And I think it's such a phenomenal thing you did, and such a great example that you shared about how you handled those first few days with your team. That was a lot of me talking. Any final thoughts on that
No,
topic?
I would just say in general, parents, Luke, I think sometimes I think parents are the biggest allies we have. And if you have the right parents, like get to know them. And in my 20 years of coaching, I've spent a lot of conversations with parents that our players don't know we had because they knew beforehand. They said the trust. We both wanted what's best for Johnny, and that way we could make sure. I mean, parents will call me sometimes. Hey, he's struggling because of this and this. Will you help him out? And that way, when he has a bad practice, I know why he's struggling. I can have a conversation. I can get it out of him without him knowing I talked to his mom, and we're trying to get him better. So I think as coaches, let's try to make sure our parents know us and we know them. And I never talk basketball. I never talk, hey, scoring points or that, but it's about that kid's what's best for the kid. So I think as coaches, we got to make sure our parents can, if you spend time, and I think the Moments was a great example, if you spend time getting to know the parents, you can get more out of the kids instead of less.
Hmm, that's good. Really good stuff on your priorities relationally, culturally. I'm curious about your priorities when it came to basketball when you took over, right? And I think this can apply to coaches of any sport. So as you took over this team and this program, uh, how did you evaluate where they were at when it came to the sport and the team? And then how did you decide what you were going to do on the basketball court with your systems and strategies, your tactically? How did you evaluate and make some of those decisions and then decide, how to roll things out? Because I think that's an important factor that we need to consider when we take over a team or program too of, okay, am I coming in? Am I going to do what they've been doing or pieces of what they've been doing in the past? Or am I coming in and I'm just bringing all new stuff when it comes to the game? Will you tell me about what that was like for you and your staff?
Yeah. The first thing I did is I didn't want to watch any previous stuff from them because I could be jaded in how they were coached. If you don't know how they're coached, good or bad, I wanted to have a fresh opinion. And I told our guys right away, I'm going to judge everybody. I don't care what you did last year. It's a new start for everybody. And for me, I kind of got to know our team a little bit through watching them play a little bit, Luke, and realized that we're going to struggle to shoot the ball. So what I have is a vision of 3 to 4 years where we're going to be when we can get recruiting cycles through here. But then knowing we got to put our guys in best positions to succeed today, while we build for the future. Can you do both at the same time? I think as our job as our coaches is to utilize a player's strengths to hide their weaknesses. So knowing a little bit more after I watched our guys play, we had some athletic guys get downhill, maybe not as good as shooters as we're going to bring in the future, but they have a lot of strengths. So we created some different ways. I know the thing we did with Doug Lamov, you were talking about double gaps, and we opened up a lot of double gaps, Luke. We drove a lot of double gaps to let those athletes get downhill. So I'm going to zoom back for a second. So we kind of learned our guys, and then I decided when I became a head coach, I was going to experiment some. And one nice thing about taking over a rebuild is you don't like, hey, there wasn't, you got to win 20 games. I won 20 games the year before. So defensively, I always said, hey, I want to be a little bit different. So we actually play a zone that Mary Mac plays really well with Joey Gallo. And I got to know their staff. I know those guys. I went up there, spent 2 days with them. And I said, I'm going to try something wholly different because we had athletic wings that fit our personnel. And I also am more of an offensive coach. So the more I talked to those guys, less we had to do with scouting, less we had to do this. So I spent a lot of our time with offense because I think offense is harder to learn than defense. Um, and then I knew how we wanted to play fast break. I know how we wanted to play. We call it the blender when we get an advantage. So we really taught how to play basketball. But then some of the nuts and bolts were a little different than when we down the road. So some of it was looking at our roster, and some of it's willing to experiment and try something. And now I've never played zone in my life, and now we played 40 minutes of zone every game and every year. But I liked it. I learned some stuff, and we're going to experiment more next year. I already said we're going to do some different things. We lost some of those athletes. How do we evolve? So to basically answer your question, we looked at short term. Okay, what can we do that's going to be long term solution? Let's put that stuff in. Let's say, okay, how can we win with the current roster by maybe modifying a couple things? and then knowing eventually we'll phase to where we want to be 3 or 4 years down the road. But I gave everybody an opportunity, and early on in all our preseason workouts, Luke, everybody was equal teams. We never put our best, quote unquote, best players together. We did equal teams. We even went as far, Luke, when our first 2 scrimmages, I told our guys we don't have starters yet, because you start once you put 5 guys out to start, everybody thinks they're the starters, right? So what we did is we put our guys in a hat. We had 12 guys who were going to play. We put the names in a hat, and guys drove the names out of the hat who was going to start. And the guys went nuts. They had so much fun. And we said, hey, everybody's going to play equal, and it released some pressure for everybody. And we just made sure that that it was competitive, and everybody knew that they had an opportunity to earn playing time. So that's how we decided schematically what to do. And I'm already excited for this offseason to tweak some things on both sides of the ball.
That's cool. I enjoyed, hearing your reflection on that, and I like you're willing to experiment, be a little bit different. Like you said too, maybe a little bit easier to do it when you walk into a situation where there aren't super high expectations, where and you feel a little bit more freedom of, yeah, I can try something. Like, what's the worst that's gonna happen, right? And then I think again, what you shared there around you and your staff were so conscientious about the perspective and feelings and really uncertainty that those players were experiencing with a new coach and new coaching staff coming in. Right? Because it's a huge change, tons of uncertainty. That's just a great way for anxiety to spring up in a group of people, especially a team. And so to be considerate and conscientious of, okay, even in how we set up our teams, we're going to balance them. Okay, we're going to draw names out of a hat, right? Right. Again, it's like being very thoughtful about the social dynamics at play, I think is really, really important, especially early on, like you did, because if you're not, all of a sudden, you do something unintentionally, you just split up the teams. I want to see these 5 best guys play together, and then all of a sudden, you've got 3 or 4 guys who their effort just tanks because, oh well, coach has already made up his mind, and you haven't. And yes, that's an issue. Like, that's an issue that athlete needs to mature mentally and emotionally to be able to handle a situation like that. And also, it might not even be worth creating a situation where that could happen, especially early on, before you really know the players well and have that relationship with them. Where, well, if that happens later in the season and they do that, you can have a very honest conversation with them where you say, John, are you really going to pout and not bring your best because I put these 5 guys together? Which one of those 5 guys do you think you should replace right now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's why you're here, right? When you have a real reason why you should be in that group, then let's talk about it honestly. But you not bringing your best, that's not helping you get there, right? But you can't have that conversation necessarily right at the start. And so I think it's highlights why it was so important for, to be very considerate of the social dynamics at play, even when you're splitting up teams for a practice and you're just watching and evaluating. Uh, let's talk now. Let's talk about getting into year one. Right, you've taken over now. Um, Talk to me about some of the biggest challenges and struggles in this first year. So I'll let you. That's broad. Take it wherever you want. I mean, you can go through the different phases of the season and what the challenges and struggle were. You can talk about just overall. Maybe there were certain situations. What was hard about the year?
I think a couple things. The first thing that was harder than maybe I thought is when I was assistant. You thought, oh, everybody says when you move over a seat, it's harder. It's different, and I think one thing is your perspective is different of everything, so you're viewing it on a different lens. So I think the one thing that I learned really early is I need to have perspective of some guys that have done this for a while. So like Tony Shaver, I worked for at William & Mary's, the Hall of Fame coach at 2 different spots, who's now retired. So it was great. He had all the time in the world, though. I talked to Coach all the time, and he gave me a great perspective of situations he was in. So I think the hardest thing was right away, some of your perspective is a little different, that making sure you ask other people. Hey, I had Brandon Linton, who's head coach at Tufts. I worked at the Army. I had a situation. I'll give you a situation. Was a little tough. We had a kid, Sam Tabe, who came back as our best player, really good player, but he was struggling. He wasn't a great kid. We had great relationship, worked hard. he wasn't doing the things he needed to do to produce at the level that we thought he could. And I talked to Brandon about some stuff. Hey, well, how do I handle this? Right? Like he's at the time maybe our eighth or ninth best player, Luke. Everybody thinks he's our best player. And so Brandon really helped navigate something that he learned at Tufts through one of his players. And I brought Sam in and I said, Sam, just so you know, we pulled names out of a hat, but if we started tomorrow, you're not going to start. And here's why. And here's the things you need to do better to start. And I think he's a very open, very coachable young man. And he realized, oh, I got to get better. Like there was the first time I think in his life he said, oh, I might not play because I didn't care who played. I was going to play the best guys. He wasn't practicing that level. And then Sam just took off. Like he took off, Luke, and said, oh, I got to. And then he was amazing. And then there was another time in the year he wasn't playing hard enough. Brought him in. We watched film and said, what do you think? And he said, before film, how hard you play, Sam? 7 or 8 out of 10. We watched the film and he said, oh, God, coach, that's 1 out of 2. Like, that's horrible. And then the next game, the first media timeout, which is 4 minutes in, he grabs his back up and shakes him. He's like, am I playing hard enough? Like, not in a negative way. Like, I want to get better. And then Sam ended up being all conference first. You know, he was a Moss. He was 17-8. But I think what I learned is consistently through the year, there is a lot of important conversations you have to have as a head coach, and you can't get tired of having them. And I'll give you another example of, we talked about once we broke the teams up. Now we had, our top group, which was about 10, and then we had our scout team. And I brought a senior in who thought maybe he was going to play, and he wasn't going to play. And I was truthful with him. And I said, here's the deal. You're not going to play. You're going to be the scout team captain. I need this energy. I need this. Well, the first practice, look, he was so bad. His energy was awful. He was exactly the opposite of what you wanted. And I grabbed him after practice and said, just so you know, Uzi, if you keep acting like that, you're not going to be part of the team much longer. And just that matter of fact, didn't need to scream at him. And then on that time on, he was elite, like energy, excitement. He scored on senior night. We ran a play first day. Jamie Christian taught me this, is if you have a walk-on, you should run a play for them on senior night. Let him score. If he doesn't matter, everybody goes nuts. He got a backdoor layup. He scored. Our bench went nuts. You'd have thought we won a national championship. And he brought that energy every day. And what was cool about Uzi, too, is we'll talk about maybe leadership culture a little bit later, but we talk all the time about everybody's a leader in our program. Everybody influences everybody, and we all need help. So sometimes when I wouldn't go to the next play or I was yelling at officials, Uzi ended up being the guy saying, hey, coach, next play, we need you. We need you. And then I would fist bump Uzi and be like, thanks, because I needed that reset, right? Just because I'm the head coach, I'm a human. I need help. And then I'd make sure the team understood, hey, Uzi helped me. Like we're helping each other. We're in this thing together. So I would say number one thing is you got to have those important conversations all the time. The other thing that's really challenging, Luke, is there's a decision fatigue a little bit. You make so many decisions. And at first, everybody has this perfect program in their mind. Like I thought when I was a head coach, I knew how I want to do every part of the program. Well, it takes a long time until everything's in place the way you want it. So for me to take a step back and say, okay, Ben, year one, there's some things that aren't going to be perfect that don't really affect winning, that I need to let go and focus on the other stuff. And then year two, we'll clean some stuff up. Year three, then we'll get to the program that's humming in every area. So for me to not try to fix everything right away and just really say, does this affect winning? And actually, Tobin Anderson, who's obviously now famous now because he made the run at FDU, I know Tobin for a while, and we actually talked because he was rebuilding FDU at the time and came from Stack, and we talked a lot about rebuilds. And he was saying the biggest thing he did at Stack before he got to FDU was all he did was focus on, does this affect winning? And he told his staff and everybody, if it doesn't affect winning, I don't want to complain about it. I don't want to worry about it. Let's fix this first and then move on. So making sure that I wasn't trying to have a perfect program in every area, Luke, and letting some things slide that this year we'll address was a little bit harder than I thought because it doesn't happen overnight. And a cool, I guess, moment for me, watching spring workouts, I had a little reflection. I'm just watching and say, man, we've come a long way, which is culture stuff, knowing drills, energy, just stuff like that, saying, man, okay, it is coming together, Ben. But there are some times I was like, man, this might take 20 years. So those are some of the challenges, and you don't have to be perfect. I think the other thing, Luke, is you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers. I think sometimes that I maybe was worried about that. And then I learned early that, hey, it's okay to adapt. It's okay to change. If we put something in, we put an action in, it didn't work, we just changed it. The guys didn't care. You worry about, you sometimes can overthink what they might think about some stuff. But those are some of the challenges we faced. I faced maybe more than the guys. And then I'd also say this is one thing I learned is make sure you know where your guys are at and what they've experienced, because like our team hasn't won a road game in over 1,000 days, our program, 1,000 days. So we were struggling early. We had started out really well, but we were all at home or neutral. And then we lost a couple road games. And then one of our players is like, yeah, coach, I've never won a road game. Well, he was a junior. And I'm like, wait a minute, you never won a road game. And so then it was like, oh, we need to talk to our guys about like road games. How do you win them? What's the mentality? And like, I learned a lesson that like making sure you understand that, oh, these guys haven't won on the road. How do we address that before we get on the road? So I don't know if that's some of the things off the top of my head.
That's great, man. That's 1,000 days. That's a long time. Yeah, but it's a good point, right? The more you know about your context, environment, the team before you got there, I think is valuable stuff, because all of a sudden you're like, wait, what? You had no idea. But again, once you knew that, you realize, no, well, we actually need to address this. And I think it's so important what you shared about, you just can't get tired of having those conversations. And I mean, I will attest to that and say there were days this last season where I did not want to have the conversation I knew I needed to have. Man, I wish that I could just avoid this conversation. But I think when you're like you, when you're like me, and probably most of the coaches listening, when you have a vision of what you want it to be like, okay, if I want to get there, I gotta have a conversation, right? We've got to eliminate some of these things. We got to have more of these things. And you also made a great point of, got to realize that it takes time to bring that vision to life. It isn't an instant thing as much as we would like it to be.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and a huge thanks to Coach Wilkins for joining me. You can find links to connect with Ben in the show details. And don't forget to check out the show details for links if you'd like to get access to the free podcast notes or register or learn more about the upcoming Film for Coaches workshop. Thanks for listening to the podcast. We'll see you next week.